This is the Chatbot Roadshow. I'm Greg, joined by Justin again. Justin, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing all right. So today we're going to walk everybody through a demonstration of the LifeLink clinical trial solution, specifically focused on how the chatbots help patients schedule appointments. So before we begin, at a high level, clinical trials have not been a great experience for patients.
That's right. Trials have gotten more complex over the last 20 years, and the beginning of a trial experience, which is crucial, has not improved.
So while the concept of a virtual trial is not necessarily a unique thing, in many cases trials involve getting a patient to a physical place. And when you think about the process involved in doing that, most of the trial teams are using old world processes like phone call agents and paper forms and inefficient manual processes. And that's really not an ideal scenario.
That's right. Small armies of clinical research associates scattered at thousands of sites across the country power these trials. And to patients that are consumers in other parts of their lives, this feels like an incredibly old fashioned, old school way to engage with your healthcare providers.
Right. So when you think about technology and where it's at in the consumer world, we've really shifted into a next level paradigm, and that is it's mobile, but it's messaging, it's conversational, it's a lot like the way we interact with friends via texting. And when you look at the way people interact and behave with texting, the rates of engagement are pretty strong. Everybody knows how to do it. It's sticky. People respond to text. And so this really creates an opportunity for a new way when it comes to running a clinical trial.
The beautiful thing about clinical trials, as scripted and defined as they are through IRB protocols, is that not only can we reach patients and participants through messaging, but we can actually automate a large percentage of that interaction. All of the care coordination, education, instruction that's defined in the protocol can now be automated via text message and mobile messaging.
So it's a pretty broad process when you think of all of the touch points and workflows involved between a CRO and a group of patients. But today we're going to focus just on the scheduling dimension because that really is an area that is ripe for opportunity. We'll walk through a quick demonstration of how that works. We'll show what's required below the waterline and then talk about some of the analytics that you get out of it. So when you think of scheduling, there's a chasm. This is a big, big weak spot in the way that these trials have been run historically.
If you're looking at ways to compress trial timelines, there's no better place to start than the scheduling of the first office visit. It's where the holdup is. A lot of sites struggle to execute on it. And if you look at dissatisfied patients that choose not to participate in a trial, the drop off around scheduling and the lack of response from sites is one of the most frustrating pieces of that top of funnel experience.
Right. I'm going to flip it over to you now to walk through a demonstration on how the LifeLink solution helps automate and streamline this whole dimension of the trial process.
We've certainly seen this come up as a problem time and time again across trials of all stages and types. And what we'll show you today is how the LifeLink solution and conversational solutions can ease the friction for patients to make it easy for them to schedule that first office visit. So you can imagine I'm a participant that has first learned about a trial, and the first thing I have to get through is eligibility and screening. Typically, this is done over the phone or in person with a patient, but a chatbot could also handle that same workflow to educate the patient about what's required in the trial and to also walk them through the eligibility criteria. In certain cases, if there are sensitive questions that are being asked as part of the eligibility criteria, a chatbot can actually be a preferable experience to interacting with a human about it if it has to do with a sensitive condition, for example, like your smoking behavior, if you're participating in a smoking related trial. Once I've gone through the eligibility flow and I've ensured that I meet the top level eligibility criteria for the trial, I can move on to education and informed consent. And a lot of investigators take this moment as a chance to identify patients that might be at risk for dropping out of trials later because they didn't properly understand the protocol or requirements of that trial. So in this particular case, the investigators have recorded a short video that explains what's expected of me if I do enroll in this trial. If a chatbot is delivering that education, I can also, as an investigator, use that moment to understand how well my content performs in front of patients and if the patients understand what's being presented of them through a series of sentiment checks and comprehension questions. And once I've gone through that education and consent flow, I'm now ready to schedule my first appointment. In many trials, At this point, the name and number of the patient that's met the eligibility criteria is passed on to the sites, and it's up to the sites to reach out to that patient. In certain cases, if the site is on top of the workflow, that can be a couple hours lag. But in many cases, that can be several days before the patient is able to schedule that first appointment. If a chatbot were managing that scheduling conversation, we could actually move the patient directly from eligibility and education directly into the scheduling conversation. So we could reach out immediately after consent via text message to that patient. I would receive a secure URL in the text message, which I could then open to have a HIPAA compliant browser session. So text message isn't a secure channel to have that conversation in, but once I'm in this browser-based session, I can prove I am who I say I am using the first 3 letters of my last name and my year of birth. And now with no app download, no username and password, I'm able to have this secure conversation about scheduling in a matter of seconds, not minutes or days. Because the chatbot already knows what my zip code is based on what I put in the eligibility criteria, it will offer me a number of participating sites around me that might be the most appropriate. I live in Oakland, so I can select Dr. Lee, who's also in Oakland. And I can actually see Dr. Lee's schedule that he's reserved for the clinical trial. And I can select from the dedicated appointment slots and self-schedule myself. So I'm taking an experience that used to be several phone calls over several days to schedule that first appointment to something that's fully patient guided. It's easy for me as a participant to select that time slot. Once I've confirmed a time that works for me to have my first office visit with Dr. Lee, I can also receive appointment confirmations and follow-up reminders in a number of different ways. In this case, I want to start by saving it to my Apple Wallet so I don't forget about that office visit, but I could also get follow-up appointment reminder texts and emails if that would be helpful as well. And dozens of small moves like this that make it easy for patients to schedule that first office visit can be the difference between meeting a trial recruitment timeline and having that timeline doubled or tripled in length. To reduce the drop off from 35% down to 20% or 15% can have tremendous impact on the trial timeline and performance.
Okay, great. So that really is a slick looking process, but there's an immense amount of below the waterline horsepower that's required to pull that off. So let's take a look at what kind of systems and scheduling models you need to make a system like this perform the way you just described.
Sure. While scheduling might feel like this singular and easy experience, it actually can be very different depending on the enrollment volume of a trial or the site's readiness operationally or technically to support different scheduling models. And LifeLink comes ready with multiple scheduling models to flex in different trial settings, starting with the simplest models on the bottom left, where the chatbots are assisting clinical research associates or patient access agents at the sites to schedule those appointments manually, all the way up to actually direct scheduling, like we showed in the demo, to allow patients to self-schedule their own appointment slots based on what times work for them without any type of human intervention and everything in between.
And below the waterline, there's a lot of pretty heavy duty enterprise connectivity and workflow automation that has to happen to make all that stuff come to life, right, Justin?
That's right. This is a much more complex process than a single conversation turn. For example, hey, Alexa, turn on the lights. It requires stitching together multiple backend systems of record in many cases, and involves orchestrating a patient journey that may happen over one session or it may happen over 5 sessions and multiple days. And it takes a lot of workflow orchestration and integration and assimilation capabilities to make that experience sing for a patient.
Right. So don't try this at home, folks. Okay, so when a patient goes through this experience, we're collecting a lot of very granular behavioral data in terms of what they're doing with the bot, the information that they're providing. That leads us to a pretty interesting set of business intelligence and analytics reports that we can get out of this.
That's right. When you allow chatbots and conversational systems to automate an entire workflow like scheduling, you get a level of visibility and insight into that process that you never could have before if it was a manual process. You understand exactly how long it took patients or participants to get from conversation bubble to conversation bubble, exactly where in the scheduling workflow they fell off. And that translates to actionable insights that you never had before. If you're running a program like this, you can imagine that you start with just your basic conversion funnel, which patients are converting, how many are scheduling without any additional assistance, and how many patients are being escalated to frontline clinical research associates. But you could drill down one level deeper and mesh engagement data, how participants are engaging with the chatbot, with the answers that they're providing us and the workflows that they're completing. So you can see how likely it is that a patient in a certain zip code in the Bay Area would be to enroll in a clinical trial with a provider that's in San Francisco or in Oakland. Or if you're deep into the recruitment experience, you can actually start slicing that data by patient demographic to identify specific patient populations that you want to focus on. So if you're only able to follow up with 20% of the total participants that have completed awareness and eligibility flows, you would want to understand which patient cohorts are struggling with comprehension, which ones require additional assistance, and which ones are actually able to self-schedule on their own. And being able to point human teams at the 20% of participants that need the most help is an immensely valuable activity that generates a lot of ROI in terms of your operational efficiency and gearing your teams up for success.
Okay, great. Well, there's actually a press release about this capability that's on the LifeLink website. Justin, you were part of that project from the get-go. Can you just give a couple highlights of how that went?
Yeah, the BRCA Founder Outreach Study was a remote clinical trial led by a consortium of large cancer centers, including Memorial Sloan Kettering, that pioneered the use of chatbots for everything from enrollment, consent, ordering lab tests with Quest, and following up with patient-reported outcomes. LifeLink powered that whole experience, and it gave a tremendous amount of scale to that clinical research team trying to do research on thousands of participants over the course of years.
Right. And it was probably the first of its kind to ever do something like that through a conversational technology like this. You can find that press release on the LifeLink website. So, Justin, thanks a bunch for joining us. This has been the Chatbot Roadshow.
Thanks for having me.
Hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Chatbot Roadshow. You can find other hospital, pharmaceutical, and research solution demos in our resource library at lifelink.com.